welcome. We know I won't stay here long, but I'm trying to get it set up so when I do. It is a delight to be here on the last night of the Lenten Lecture Series. I'm particularly grateful to Deb and David for dinner together this evening. I had a lovely conversation with Bob this afternoon over tea and coffee. The hospitality that this congregation extends and has extended to me is remarkable, and I want to thank you. Not all communities do that well, and you do it faithfully every time. So thank you so much for the ways you've welcomed me into your home, to your table, to your worship, and into conversation with you. It's truly a privilege. And I can say this, and I truly mean this, even as an introvert. You will need to go into a hole for about 3 days after something like this. That I always leave here with a bittersweet heart, because it's just so fun to work on these texts with you. And some of my students aren't so happy to see me back. So, yeah, you aren't graded, or there isn't that part of the whole thing. So anyway, thank you so much for the invitation to be with you again, and I hope our paths will cross again often. My goal for the night, we know I start off that way and then I never get there, but my goal for the night is to work with you on the flood narrative, starting at the very end of chapter 5 with the birth formula of Noah. We almost got there last night. We'll spend a good bulk of the evening on the Noah story and the flood itself, and I'll try to unpack that in the ways that I do. Of course, always open to whatever observations, questions, comments you may have as we get our noses into the text. Everybody has a Bible. By this point, I think it should be an instinct. We will then talk just briefly about the Table of Nations, and then I hope to end by talking about the Tower of Babel story. And I'll say right now, in case time gets away from us, that my goal with the Tower of Babel story tonight is in some ways to simply sort of retell the story and think about how it's configured. It's a quite well-crafted 9-verse account, very balanced between human action and divine action. But the interpretation of the Tower of Babel is, of course, fraught, as we've seen all these texts, have various kinds of interpretations happening, and some of the richest interpretation happening on the Tower of Babel story right now is a conversation between North American and Western European biblical scholars and biblical interpreters from around the world who read the story quite differently. So what you'll feel at the end, I think, with the PowerPoint presentation that I got a little heavy-handed on print. I apologize. I always try to have sort of art, and there are all these theories about how people engage PowerPoint, and I haven't yet found the sweet spot, but I keep trying. It's usually a combination of a little text, a little bit of visual, a little bit of motion, which you know I'm terrible at. You'll see I get heavy-handed with some quotes towards the end so that you can hear in their own voice some interpretations from around the world about what that tower story is really all about. And hopefully that will press our own self-reflection in our own time. And then I will end, I may not get there, but my hope is to end by just crossing over into the family stories, moving from cosmic, primeval, prehistory into the first generation of family of Israel, with the promises, blessings given to Abram. I do think it's important to see what those are, because arguably those shape the rest of the Genesis story and shape the history of Israel as we know it. So I'll do my best to get there. We can work together to get there. So if you turn with me, please, to the very end of the genealogy in chapter 5. I noted last night that contrary to sort of modern instincts to read right over even skip them altogether, you can actually watch readers of Genesis. They get through 4 and they maybe stay long enough to see the development of civilization in the descendants of Cain, and then they see 5 and they go whoop right over to 6, right? It's a genealogy and we go right over it. And I was trying to emphasize last night when we were closing that we ought not move quite so quickly. That some pointers ahead are going to reveal themselves in those genealogies, both here and after the flood. And so tonight we're in some ways going to straddle 2 genealogies at the beginning and the ending of our time together. We talked a little bit sort of humorously about Methuselah and Enoch, this mysterious kind of cryptic reference to the fact that Enoch is taken up by God, walks with God. He was no more because God took him. in many ways setting the stage for the figure of Enoch as a later significant figure in the apocryphal texts. But really where I want us to focus tonight, for sake of time, is on the very last generation that's named, particularly the birth of Noah. And so what I'd like to do, let me move us so you can see it. I've tried to cue, I know the screen, maybe not all of you can see quite so clearly on the screen, and there's a lot of text tonight, so I'll make sure to read what you're seeing as well as describe what you're seeing. We're going to pick up with Noah. Lamech had lived, in verse 28, had lived 182 years. He became the father of a son. He named him Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring relief from our work and from the toil of our hands. You may recall last night we spent a little bit of time talking about the significance of birth formulas, naming formulas, specifically with regard to Cain, and Eve's naming of the significance of his name, and the absence of a birth or naming formula in the character of Abel. Tonight we're starting off by saying we get, in fact, as we would expect, the father giving the birth formula, the naming formula for the son. And there are a couple important things about this naming formula that I want to flag your attention to, because it's going to play out later. First of all, the very name Noah is related, it's a word play on the Hebrew word nicham, which means relief or comfort. Nicham, which means relief or comfort, the one who's going to bring us comfort from our toil. This verb, I'm going to move there towards the end of our conversation about the flood story. This is the verb that is foremost when we get to 2nd Isaiah. Comfort, comfort my people, for their penalty has been paid, doublefold, right? That comfort, comfort verb is the same verb here that his name is related to. So there's a word play that's going to happen between comfort, the notion of comfort or rest. The ark will come to rest. The bird will try to find rest, right? There's this sort of theme, motif is better said, a motif across this story about rest. But Noah is the one in his name, in his very name, that is to be the bearer or bringer of this comfort. And from the toil of our hands, the ground, right? This literally, it's the pain of our hands as we work this ground that has been cursed. The use of the word here, I noticed I've given you sort of my translation of this verse. If you're looking at the NRSV, you may be wondering, what is she talking about? I've said the pain of our hands. The root here is atzav in Hebrew. It is the same verb that's used in the cursing formulas for the pain of childbearing for the woman. And you're going to see very soon, it is a verb that figures in the rationale that is given for why the flood comes. Pain. So Noah, in his own naming formula, is the one who will bring relief, rest, comfort, and is connected in some way to the relief of the freedom from pain. But I want you to also keep in mind, this is not sort of hypothetical pain. I don't know if you can have such a thing. This is actually, when you hear this word, I want you to think the kind of pain that is back-breaking, gut-wrenching, heartbreaking, physical pain. It'll be important in a moment. Okay, so we've met Noah. It's important to note in this story, too, that the flood actually starts as the genealogy ends with the naming of the 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we'll talk about the movie later and who were cast in those roles now. And whether you think they were effectively cast or not. But we're going to note here, it's actually, depending on how you organize, again, structure the text, many interpreters will argue the story of the flood is framed by genealogical references, specifically to the generation that precedes and the generations that then follow. That is, you cannot think of the flood apart from a family story. It's woven into a family story, our family story. Okay, so the next thing I need to say is we're stepping into, oh yes, please. Let me step in.
Noah had 3 sons after he was 500 years old.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of the difference in age, length of life.
I was just going to be really smart and say he's really robust. It's like, it's like Sarah Later, who's, just breathtakingly gorgeous and sweaty. Pharaoh's harem. Yes. There's the scholarly answer to your question is the numbers here. We have no real sense of their function, other than most likely to try to signal significant passages of time. That is, no modern critical biblical scholar thinks there were originally these enormously long lifespans that eventually whittled down into very short lifespans after the flood. That's no longer sort of taken seriously as a reason for or a rationale for the length of the numbers. It's more often signaled as kind of a way to mark significant passages of time. Probably not satisfactory. The real answer is we have no idea. We're trying to somehow think about it, how it functions in the narrative. Please.
I know that there was an explanation given years ago on a special that I watched, that somebody counted the years up to Noah and pointed out that by the time Noah is born and has his children,
Yes.
all the rest are gone.
Yes.
Of that long lineage, he's the only one left.
He's the only one left. Yeah. There are all sorts of things you can do with these numbers, and that's one of them. Of course, is to say who's on the stage, right? So when you think about genealogies and the passages of time, what generation actually knows the prior generations and how far back? So do you know are you intersecting with your great-great-grandfather or not? That's one way to play with these numbers. But the larger question of why are they talking about lifespans in hundreds of years, we just don't know. We really just don't know. Or at least I don't know. In the little orbit of the universe I inhabit doesn't know. So, we don't know. We are, however, stepping into a very complicated text, and I would be remiss if I didn't flag to you, if you read through this in preparation for tonight, or have read it recently, you know it's actually kind of a messy text. It will feel, as we move into it, you're going to feel rather herky-jerky, if I can use that. You're going to feel at points like something's happened, and then suddenly it's happening again, or things are out of sequence. It is because, thinking about source critics and source criticism, we actually have the blending, albeit poorly, bad editor perhaps, a blending of two flood accounts. A Yahwist account, probably the older version. Remember we talked about the Yahwist writing or group of writers in the 10th century, mid-10th century. And a priestly writer writing to the exilic community or early post-exilic community. Now, you can pull any commentary on the book of Jonah, oh my gosh, you need to put me on a plane. On the book of Genesis, you can pull any commentary, and you will see, depending on the scholar's predilections, you'll see the scholar actually try to parse apart the two stories. And if we had more time, we might actually do that. I've done that in classes before. And you get this really interesting lens into the two different accounts that accent different aspects of the story differently. So if you are of that inclination, it's a worthy exercise. We just don't have time tonight to do it. I'm going to read it of a piece, but I want to name a few cues that tell you we're dealing with two accounts, or two clues that source critics would say to you indicate we're dealing with two accounts. First of all, we have two prologues, and I'm going to read both of them with you in a moment, so I won't go into any more detail than that. Essentially what happens is the narrator has front-loaded the story of the flood with two explanations for why the flood occurs, and they're held side by side. We're going to look at those in a moment. Secondly, God commands, there are two commands to Noah about how many animals to take on board this ark. Are they supposed to take a pair of each type of animal, as 6:19 to 20 says, or are they to take 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean animals, as chapter 7 suggests? So exactly how many animals get on this ark? There are two different ways of counting. The length of the flood has two different numbers associated with it. In chapters 7, 4, and 12, we're told the flood was 40 days and 40 nights, which, as you all know, is essentially the idiom or the expression for a very, very long period of time. Or you find in chapter 7, verse 6, that the flood was a whole year in length. So 2 different measurements of the length of time the flood occurs. We also get 2 different descriptions about the nature of the flood. One is, in chapter 7, verse 12, it's a great rain. The heavens just open up. If you remember the very first day, Sunday, when we were looking at how the Hebrew conception of the universe functions, what it looks like, this is the storehouses of the rains being unleashed. That's one way in which the flood is described. But only a verse before, it sounds more like the flood is a cosmic cataclysm in which there's an opening of the spring of the deep along with the heavens. If you do, let me just digress for a second, because I don't think we're going to do it with wireless and for time. But if you do get a chance to watch the trailer for the new Noah movie, there is a moment, actually towards the end, I was rewatching it this afternoon, there's a moment towards the end where water, they're trying to do both things, right? They have the rains, of course, coming down, but there's a moment where waters come shooting up out of the ground. That seems to, at least this is my exegetical interpretation of the trailer to a movie being put out by Regency Films. But my thought is, this is their attempt to capture that, the cataracts of the deep, right? The whole notion is that the island, the world is floating on this island over this deep water. Even below Sheol, the underworld, there's this deep water, and that's what gets unleashed in order for the flood to occur. We also have 2 different descriptions of leaving the ark. When and why does Noah and his family finally depart the ark? One rationale is that it happens after the sending out of various birds, right? The raven and then the dove. There's also, very closely nearby, in the same moment of the story, a direct command comes from God to say, depart, go out from the ark, you and your family. So is it because there's been this sort of scientific study of, is there a place for the birds to put their feet down, and Noah makes the decision on his own volition, or is the demarcation, I should take better cold medicine, is it because it comes from a direct command of God? And lastly, the sort of key marker for a source critic of a movement between sources is how God is referred to. And we move back and forth in the flood narrative between reference to Yahweh, the divine name, and Elohim, the more generic name used early in Genesis. So, are you at least persuaded, for the purposes of our time together, that we're reading a woven together narrative, so that the details on the ground are going to be a bit messy, but I want us to look at the larger picture, even with the inconsistencies and contradictions that greet us as we move into the story. Fair enough? Or do we need to hash out the old source critic on? Okay, great. I'm going to move. Okay, shortly after, people began, let me go to chapter 6, and then I know this is a lot of text and a lot of arrows, but I'll read it and I'll emphasize some things. The color's aiming to help you. So let me show you what happens. I'm going to skip, I'm saying it right now, I'm skipping chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. Can I hear an amen? Amen. I'm skipping it. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm just going to do what all great biblical scholars of my day and age do. We skip it. We don't talk about it. Because we really don't know. We really don't know what it's all about. Although there's a rich interpretive history about the Nephilim, this mixing of God, angels, and men. It's we don't really know what it's all about. Although, I can. One of the theories is that this is, again, if you follow the argument about the blurring of boundaries, right, and this whole notion of what is human, what is divine, and is the human sort of a mix of divine and earth, this is yet another sort of moment where boundaries are being negotiated, and lifespan, as a result, is shortened. That is all I'm going to say about that. So let me turn to chapter 6, verse 5, which 5 to 8 is considered the first prologue. I'm going to call it that. The NRSV doesn't do anything to mark it apart. But this is using source criticism, again, the notion of where the first account begins. And I'm going to separate it from where we think the second account begins because I want you to see that the narrator, by combining the two sources and weaving this together, is actually insisting on some core theological claims before we move very far. So let me read this first prologue, and then I'll show you some of the important motifs and repetitions that set the stage. The Lord saw, verse 5, that great was the evil of humankind on the earth, and every plan that their hearts devised was only evil, all of the days, or continually, as the NRSV renders it. This is more wooden with the Hebrew. And the Lord regretted that the Lord had made humankind. It pained God to God's heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out the Adam I created, bara. Do you remember that verb from Genesis 1, the verb only attributed to Yahweh? I will blot out the Adam I created from upon the face of the Adamah. From the Adam, as far as is what the preposition means, but it can also be rendered just simply to. From the Adam to the animals, to the creeping things, to the birds of the air. For I grieve, or regret, that I made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And we'll talk about the next, there's a little genealogical piece that ends this section, but I want to just talk about this first prologue. Let me note a few key features of it, at least in what the Hebrews is signaling to us as we pay attention to it. First of all, this opening prologue is framed by God's sight. God looks. God then, so it starts in verse 5, the Lord saw, ra'ah, the verb to see. Notice it ends with the favor of Noah in God's eyes. So it's framed by divine perception. God sees, and within what God sees in terms of the utter corruption of humankind, God yet sees the one who has favor, that is Noah. Secondly, verse 5 alone is insistent that everything about the human is corrupt and evil. Everything. And let me show you, let's just underscore it. Whatever translation you have, great was the evil on the earth. Every plan, call, the Hebrews that's getting repeated like a heartbeat right here, is the word call, all, every, depends on what it's connected to, how you read it. All plans that their hearts devised, only evil, ra, only evil, all the time. Okay, so one verse. What are you learning about the human condition? It's grim, right? It's very bad. It's comprehensive. It is only, you get the repetition of evil twice, but you get only evil. It's heightened, it's intensified in the second assertion. It's all of humankind, and it's all the time. What's important about this theologically, as we move into the further into the story, is that God does not do such a thing as God is about to do without absolute justification. The absolute justification for the Yahwist, this opening prologue, is there is no hope. Every device, every devising, every inclination, all the time, only evil. Do you hear it? God does not do this cavalierly. God does not do this in a mean-spirited fashion. God does this because there is no way forward. In the next verse, we get a really poignant, we get invited into what some scholars, including Walter Brueggemann, have called the pathos of God. The Yahwist is particularly, if you remember, concerned about a sort of anthropomorphic notion of God. This is the God who walks in the garden and likes the breeze. This is the God who plants the garden. This is the God who likes to dig in the soil to make the human. This is the God who molds all the creatures and brings it for naming. This is the very more fleshy kind of notion of God. And what we find here in the prologue for the Yahwist is the Lord regretted, nacham, that the Lord had made humankind on the earth, and it pained God, yatsav, to God's heart. Okay, really freighted language here. Let me just underscore it. First of all, do y'all remember the naming formula for Noah? It's related to, so this verb nacham can mean comfort or relief. It also can mean regret, pain. Let me come back here. Regret or grief. The three-letter root has this range of meaning. The narrators are very smart here. They draw from that language, right? That language of comfort that is promised by Noah. Here it is God's regret that the same verb signals. So the Lord regretted that the Lord had made humankind on the earth, and it pained God. Here's that verb, yatsab. Do you remember it? In the naming formula of Noah, the pain of our hands, the pain of childbearing, that is the pain that God feels in God's heart as a result of the evil condition of humankind. Okay, you're supposed to connect the dots. It's such an unusual verb, it's hard to think it wasn't intentionally used. The cursing for the woman and pain of, or the result of she's not cursed, but the pain in childbearing, the possibility that Noah might provide relief, comfort, is now linked here to this pain in God's heart. And notice, that it is the condition of the human heart / mind, it's the same organ in Hebrew thinking, that it is the human heart has a direct impact on the divine heart. The two are connected. So the Lord said, I will blot out, macha. This is exactly what it sounds like. The English is a great term. It is the wiping away. I will blot it out. Don't think proper blotting, like lily, a white linen tablecloth with salt and a little bit of water. Don't think that. This is sweeping blotting. This is to wipe it out. Sorry, I was thinking, sometimes I'm going to blot that. That's not this. I'm going to blot this. So I'm going to blot out the Adam. Now we're getting, the Yahwist is anchoring this in language from Genesis 2, a Yahwist account of creation, yes? I am going to blot out the Adam I created, Genesis 1 language, interestingly enough, from upon the face of the Adamah. And you're getting a pointing back to creation, are you not? From the Adam as far as the animals, the creeping things, the birds of the air. If you're not hearing the list from Genesis 1, you should. What is God going to do in the flood? God is going to uncreate the world. And the starting point is the human. And the condition of the human. That then prompts, as we were talking about last night, that then prompts grievous consequences for the rest of the created order. You cannot uncouple in these stories the condition of the human from the condition of the world. You can't do it. Notice it's repeated, this verb, this nacham, for I grieve, regret that I made them. Okay, now notice here, this is not God saying, I'm angry with them. This is not God saying, I'm annoyed with them. This is not the wrath of God in the way we will see the wrath of God in other texts. This is the grief of God, the broken-hearted God, the inconsolable God, who can see no other path forward. But there is a path. And that is in the figure of Noah, whose naming formula we have already heard. And there's a sound play here. Noah found chen. Noach found chen in the eyes of the Lord. Inverting the two Hebrew letters. Noach and chen. Right? Just flipping them around. So Noach is this bearer of comfort. And Noach is the chen, is the only one who has the favor. And to have favor in the eyes of someone is exactly as we might imagine. It is to be looked at with hope and possibility. And, in most cases in the Old Testament, to have some accountability for the one for whom you have favor. Right? So think about Boaz and Ruth. Ruth appeals to Boaz and says, if I can find favor in your eyes, right, will you do the following for me? There's an accountability or responsibility that can be paired with having favor. So the reader might be perked up at this moment. let's look at what happens right after this, and then I'll open the floor if there are questions or observations you want to make. We move from this really poignant prologue into verses 9 and 10. These are the descendants of Noah. We just heard this, but we're going to hear it again. These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man. Okay, now we're getting some character to Noah as a figure. Why is it that this one has found chen, favor in the eyes of God? Well, this one is a righteous man, blameless in his generation. You all catch that? Noah walked with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Okay, this is interesting because it's caused a lot of spilled ink over the centuries. On the one hand, Noah's being lifted up. The favor that Noah has is as a result of some characteristic of him. That is his righteousness, his uprightness. But notice that the narrator doesn't simply say he's blameless and upright. The narrator adds the phrase, in his generation.
For these rotten people,
He's the best there is. So some interpreters want to say, yeah, before you raise that, little words matter, right? Before you raise up Noah on some sort of pedestal like Job, for example, who's blameless and upright, and is in fact blameless and upright and innocent, the narrator, God, everybody in the book knows except for Job's friends, right? So there we have a blameless and upright character. Noah is a blameless and upright character in his generation. And many interpreters over the centuries have underscored that to say, Noah is the hope, but it's a slim hope. Right? It's the only one that can be found in this desolate, utterly corrupt, only evil, all the time generation. So how Russell Crowe personifies Noah will be interesting. So let me pause there. This is the first prologue. Questions or comments? What do you observe? Anything strike you that you want to raise before we see how the priestly writer introduces the flood? Anything?
God's emotion is so poignant.
This is the and what this is going to come back to us at the end of the flood story. This moment is going to be also at the back end of the flood. This whole diagnosis of the human condition and its effect on the divine heart is going to come back to us at the other end. One of the big questions, of course, is here humanity feels totally forsaken. There is no way forward except for perhaps this one figure. Is the human heart going to change as a result of the flood or not? That's what one might hope. Anything else you want to observe? Right.
It seems to me that the blameless in his generation, I know it doesn't say blameless alone of his generation, but it could carry that kind of meaning.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's all in how you want to then read, why is it that God grants favor to Noah? So here's the implications theologically. If you say Noah is blameless and upright, then he's worthy, and right in this mass of only evil, he's worthy of receiving favor. But if he's blameless and upright in a very bad generation, and he's sort of the best we can get, then God's decision to yet allow or yet lift up Noah is perhaps more about God's own decision to find a way forward when there is no way forward. You see? It has some bearing on how you read God's actions.
That's more consistent with the verses ahead.
Correct. Correct. Any other observations you want to make? Yes, please.
Up to this point, there hasn't been any explanation of what it means to be worthy of God's favor.
Yes.
There's no religion.
Yes.
There's no code of ethics.
Yes.
There's no 10 Commandments.
Yes.
And so, in none of these first 5 chapters is there any. There's no church. There's nothing you're supposed. So there are no rules to live on.
Right.
But suddenly you're supposed to be doing all these things.
Yes. Yeah, it's again, it's one of those, yep, that's the way it is. Sadly, but it is sort of like we were talking last night about the Cain and Abel, which is one sacrifice, one offering more valuable than the other, more worthy of God's recognition than the other. Well, if you want to read in law codes and understandings, sure, we can make that case. But the narrative as we're unfolding it doesn't presume any of that. So what does it actually mean to say he's blameless and upright? Well, In this narrative, all we know is that he's singular in his generation, and it's whatever he is doing is worthy of God's favor. That's all we know. We're not getting any guide for what that looks like. Although, let me say this. One of the things we're going to see as we move further in, of course, is the mark of Noah is A, he's very quiet, and B, he's highly obedient. I mean, almost all we get about him is he was obedient. He was obedient. He was obedient. Right? So there is this, in his character as it plays out, which, by the way, is a very flat character. I mean, we really aren't invited into his interior life at all. In the movie, you will be invited into it. I'm commentating on a movie I haven't seen, but I can imagine Russell Crowe's going to want you to feel his pain. In the biblical story, we're not allowed into that. The mark of him consistently is his obedience.
It's kind of
Yes.
true.
To follow up on that, we have no idea how everyone got so evil. I mean,
Yes.
we have Cain and Abel,
Yes.
and we have the first murder. But then all of a sudden, after everything was so good, now everything's so evil.
Yeah, and it's a thin thread, right? We have to trace it from Cain and Abel through Lamech. Interesting. Did you all catch the repetition of Lamech there? So there's the Lamech who is declaring to his two wives, I've had vengeance on a man and a young man, 77-fold, right? So we're seeing the spread. I mentioned last night that we are getting some indication that humanity is taking vengeance, death, into their own hands. But if you're right, and then we sort of lose the thread as we make our way through the genealogy, and then suddenly we're at Noah. But the implication is that what we're starting to see, narratively, the implication is what we're starting to see happen with Lamech, and then Lamech is, of course, the father who names Noah, interestingly enough. You're getting this spread, this vengeance that's spreading across that then is picked up. But yeah, we're moving through time, and we're moving through a piece of the narrative that doesn't get as much attention. Suddenly, the condition of humankind is utterly evil.
So we sort of suspect that Noah hasn't murdered anybody.
We sort of suspect. We sort of suspect. That might be one mark of what makes one blameless and upright. Yeah. Good. Shall I move? Would you like to see how the priestly rite introduces us? So right after this mention of the descendants and this mark of Noah being blameless and upright, we get the second prologue to the flood. And it's the priestly prologue. Now, I'm going to read my translation on the screen. It's very similar to what you have in the NRSV. Now, the earth was corrupt, shachat, before God. The earth was full of violence, hamas. God saw the earth, behold. It's actually in Hebrew, it's a, behold is, do people still say behold? It's like hene, it's like tada, it's like pow. Pay attention. Hene. It's like being, whoa. It's like whoa. So what it's doing in this part of the text, though, God saw the earth, bam, it was corrupt. Like, look, it's corrupt. It's an accent. It's an exclamation mark. It's an arrow. It's whatever you need to say. This is what you got to pay attention to. For all flesh had corrupted its ways on the earth. And God said to Noah, an end to all flesh is coming before me, for the earth is full of violence because of them. Behold, hene, I will destroy them along with the earth. Okay, so let me observe a few things, and you might see some things I don't. First of all, the key verb through this second account is shachat, and it's used in various ways, in the same way nacham was used in the prior. First of all, the earth is diagnosed as being shachat, corrupt. Secondly, we know the earth, it's repeated again, right? God saw, this repetition of God's vision, right? God saw that it was shachat, it was corrupt. But why? Because all flesh actually participate in the activity of corrupting their own ways. So it's both sort of used adjectively to diagnose the state of all flesh. It's also an active verb to say they're doing it to themselves. Finally, you see it in the last, interestingly, in the very last part of this prologue, where God says, so guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to shachat the earth because of them. So the very action that humanity is doing to itself, that it has put the earth in this condition, is now the consequence they will receive from God's own hand. Okay, notice in both of these, I'll now open the floor. Notice in both of these prologues, God's vision, right? God's observing the world and making some evaluative judgments about it. Notice also that God is responding. There's a reciprocal or relational dynamic to what God is doing. In the first prologue, the human heart has broken the divine heart. And God will then, this grief will then prompt God's machat. There's even a sound play with machat, Noach, Nacham, right? It's all of a piece. In the second, the human condition has tarnished the earth, corrupted the earth. They're doing it to themselves, and God is going to respond in kind. The other thing I want you to note here is the use of violence twice. This, in the first prologue, it's about the inclinations of their hearts was always evil or only evil all the days, our thinking, our devising. The second prologue amps it up, not that thinking and devising evil isn't a bad thing, but here you're getting the added dimension of actual violent behavior. So the world, and it's not just that they're violent, the world is full of it, malah. The world is filled with violence. Okay, so let me just underscore a couple things I've said, but I want to underscore it before we move too far. First of all, God is going to respond to wickedness and evil and violence, according to these two prologues juxtaposed one to the other, with utter seriousness. Let me say it one more time. God is going to respond, this narration says, to violence and evil and wickedness with the gravest of actions, with grave seriousness. Secondly, God is paying attention even to the inclinations of our hearts, to which God's own heart responds. And lastly, God does not in this narrative act out of sudden or arbitrary instincts. Both prologues, both accounts of the flood begin with a rationale. Whether you like it or not, they're both trying to set the stage to say this was coming to all flesh. Now, lastly, let me add this. I didn't have it in my notes, but let me add it. One thing I didn't highlight in the first, and I need to point out in the second, is this repetition of on the earth, Adamah, right, on the ground, and then notice this: the earth, the earth, the earth, the earth. We've already mentioned the consequences for the human community have rippling effects for all creatures on the earth. But both prologues repeat again and again, it is the whole of God's creation that is going to bear the brunt of this. They don't let you ever forget that all flesh are of the earth. Okay, so let me pause there before we look at the ark. Any comments, questions, observations, concerns, disbeliefs? Please.
There's somewhat of a parallel of this prologue with the prologue in the first chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Flipped on its side, on its spot.
So what was really, really good is now wholly evil. Yeah, you're right, yeah, absolutely. And we're getting enough, I think that's a really important thing to know. Did everybody hear? You're getting, Genesis 1 is so much about the goodness of creation. It's tov, it's good. Here we're getting evil, Hamas, full of, right? You're getting this very utterly bereft language in juxtaposition. It is a bad counterbalance.
And again, God's going to act in
Yes.
the midst of the chaos.
Yes, exactly. And we're going to have chaos come into a situation of human-caused chaos.
Well, the first prologue,
Yeah.
it's more directly human caused. The second one sounds like we're all.
Yeah, exactly.
So there is a difference there.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a great observation. The second one, the priestly account kind of holds it. The first, it's a great observation. First is very much about humankind, right? Whom I created, whom I made. The second one is a little more open, right? It's all flesh are corrupt. And we're not sure quite what to do with that. Although the priestly writer is concerned, of course, about clean animals and unclean animals, so there seems to already be a sort of a distinction happening in this text, but it's an important observation. Anything else you want to say? Please.
What parallels are there to the flood stories in other religions?
For time reasons, I'm not going into all that. It's a great question. We, of course, have other ancient Near Eastern flood stories. I mentioned one on Sunday, the Atrahasis story, where Atrahasis is the hero of the epic and builds an ark. There's no concern there for keeping the animals or bringing the birds and fish and all that on board. Not fish, but the reptiles on board. Actually, I had a student in January say to me, "Do you all get that the fish and the sea monsters were just having a great time? Like, the world was theirs for a season, and right?" And again, one of those things you just never think about. Yeah, the sea monsters had a great time. But there's no, in the Atrahasis epic, there's no mention of concern for the animals or preservation of other living creatures. The Gilgamesh epic is probably most similar in terms of the core story about the ark and the narrative there, Utnapishtim and Gilgamesh. So if you want to read those, there's a lot of similarities. Differences in terms of the name of the ark, the design of the ark, the length of the flood, and all those kinds of things. But again, it's the gods destroying the earth and the hope for survivor. So there are ancient Near Eastern parallels for sure. Okay, so Shel, yes, please.
So I had never thought about this before until you were going through this and talking about specifically about God's pain
Yes.
with the world. Okay, so I think there's some foretelling here, coming out, because if God was that disappointed, if the whole world was bad, He very easily could have started over again.
Yes.
Created another.
Yes.
Then creation. He's going to go back and do creation again.
Yes.
And maybe this time Adam and Eve and all the other kind of stuff. But He doesn't do that. He
Right.
does seek this way out.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that the message there is no matter how deep your sorrow, how deep your pain, okay, there is a way to get through this.
Yes.
Through faith in God.
Excellent. So there's, I love what you're doing theologically, that moving it towards self-ownership. What is this story teaching me about the nature of God and how I can think about God in the midst of a calamity or a storm or the horrors of the world, right? How can I think about that? I think that's a really important place to go. There is going to be an uncreation and a recreation in this story. We do have this solitary figure in his family that are the vehicles of that. There is a preservation of what was, even as it's going to be something new in the new creation. So you are thinking here theologically about a God who wants there to be severe consequences for the violence and corruption that is now rampant. And yet, this is back to the relational God we were talking about Genesis 1. This is the God who cannot, as my rabbi friend would say, cannot give up on the human experiment. Just can't do it. Wants to somehow preserve a relationship, even a flawed, broken one. And that's the God that's we're going to see what happens as we get further into the flood.
And your observation that the path out is through Noah, who is righteous, but he's not perfect.
Excellent.
He's not without sin.
So where you locate yourself in the story, too. So if you think, is it possible?
Exactly.
There might be one among us, or maybe me even, who could be just enough, right? In my generation, maybe just enough, right, to hold us together. That is actually, when you think theologically about the significance of the story for the human community, I think you're exactly right to accent that. As bad as the indictment is, it reads actually as an indictment, a judicial indictment. As bad as it is, God nonetheless says, I'm still going to make a way with this human being, right? I'm still going to do it. I'm still going to do it. So let's see what happens. I need to say a couple things about the ark. Oh, yeah, okay. A couple things about the ark. The ark. I hope you know, but I'll say it just in case you don't know. The ark, the word used in Hebrew for ark is tebah. When I did the Exodus lectures here a couple years ago, I talked about the significance of this word because it only occurs twice in the Old Testament. Once here as this ark for the bearing of the animals of Noah's family, and in Exodus chapter 1 with Noah, chapter 2, with Moses and the basket that Moses is put in. The one who is drawn out of the water by Pharaoh's daughter, the one who will draw Israel out of the water through the Red Sea. There's echoes back here to this particular ark as the one that draws the human and living creature community through the waters. So the word is a significant theological word in linking these stories. And there is, in fact, at the back end of this story, an exodus of sorts as they leave out of the boat and begin to settle into a new land. So there's some reverberations in terms of the story world as well. But the ark itself is interesting, and there's all sorts of interpretation about, and all sorts of artistic renditions of what the ark looks like. Let me just say that. But it's clear that the ark, the numbers and the measurements and various things, it's clear that the ark is meant to symbolize in some way a microcosm of the universe. So it has 4 sides, like the 4 winds, the 4 directions, of course, and 3 floors to it. So this, the heavens, the earth, and the underworld, the waters beneath the world, are mirrored in the decking of the boat itself. So there is a sense that in Genesis 1, of course, God creates this 3-leveled world for all of God's creatures to dwell in. And then when the ark is built, this 3-leveled world is recreated in order to bear representatives of all those creatures through the flood. So the ark itself, and there's a picture actually at the bottom here I've pulled. This is one of many examples. The notion of it being quite long, 4-walled, 3-decked. I can't help myself. You can actually go on the Noah movie website and tour the ark. I've done it. In solid research study for preparation to be with you this night, I have toured the ark. I'm telling you, you can do the bird deck, you can do the mammal deck, you can do the reptile deck, and you can see the furnace, and you can sit with the family and have dinner, and it's just really... It's remarkable. You can do it on the website. You can do it. What's that?
The waist deck.
And the waist deck. Oh yeah. Well, and there's a debate. There's a debate about where the waist was kept. Was the waist, did it all go to the bottom of the boat and somehow get, or was there some way they got the waist to the top of the boat, and then as the waters would hit the boat, they would try to... You can only imagine how much waste would have been on that boat. And anyway, the smell of it, in any case. Okay, so...
I want to hear the scholarly paper.
Oh yeah. I don't think you're going to find many willing to write it. I don't think it's going to be the directions to the ark follow the second prologue, of course. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood, rooms, cover it with pitch. There's this whole sense of it being covered with, it's this strange wood. We don't hear reference to this kind of wood very often. And there's the deck part. Go to verse 17. For my part, says God, I'm going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, which in it is the breath of life. I lost my place here. Everything that is on the earth shall die. Yes, please.
You know, that I wanted to go back. I was thinking about the question about the fish before she even you answered her question.
Yeah.
And it just occurred to me here, reading this again, all flesh that's breathing shall die, everything.
Yes.
You go back to the beginning days where he created the fish swimming in the sea. So obviously that was an intentional act.
Yes.
And as you were saying, the levels and the water underneath, do you think, and this may be totally crazy, but do you think the fact that the fish were not referenced as dying, there was no method for them to die, has something to do with living water?
Oh, interesting.
Because water is so important in the Bible in so many ways.
Yeah, I think it's almost. I mean, it's an interesting way to sort of play with it a little bit and think about what it might indicate. I'm sort of more disposed to think it's just an error in the. It's just sort of a missed moment in the narrative world. there wasn't a lot of concern to name the destruction of the fish and the sea monsters. It just didn't figure into it. But I mean, because
water in so much of
yeah, and because water is so significant, yeah, and chaos, water is chaos is certainly significant. So I don't know about the connections to living water, but it is interesting that there's this whole vast part of creation that isn't mentioned as being utterly destroyed. Yeah. Okay, so let me come back to this. I simply want to highlight here before we move over to talk about the next piece, is you get for the first time in verse 18 the language of covenant, berit. I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind, or pairs of every kind, 7 of every kind, depending on which story. Keep them alive with you. They will be male and female. We're getting, again, this sort of reminder that everything has its kind, right? At the most basic level, things have its kind, and male and female are the fullest manifestation of every kind. So we bring all of that on the boat with us. You shall take food that is eaten, store it up. It shall serve as food for you and them. Here's what we get of Noah's action, verse 22. Noah did this. He did everything, all that God commanded him, right? The obedient Noah. Chapter 7, I'm going to move through, but this is where the text starts to get mixed as to when things are happening and when the rains begin, when the floods come. If you look, starting at verse 1 of chapter 7, everyone goes into the ark. You alone are righteous before me in this generation. Take 7 pairs. I'm going to send rain. I will blot it all out from the earth. Verse 6, I'm skimming because this is where it gets a little messy. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters comes on the earth. They all were in the ark. It's almost belabored reading at points. Did you notice that? It's almost like, yeah, we know this. They get on the ark. We know this. They get on the ark. But that actually is a narrative device. Right? Something's happening to you when you start to feel weary reading the same list of animals getting on the ark. What's happening to you as a reader when you hear that over and over again?
You're as weary as they were on the ark.
You're probably as weary as a reader as they are on the ark. You're also not able to forget it. Right? The narrator wants you not to forget, and the way you do that, I mean, people tend to read one thing and forget it. So repetition serves here to make sure you absolutely understand who got on this ark.
That's what you hear it.
And if you're reading it out loud, you'll hear, and I'm going to read a portion in a moment, so you hear the effect of this kind of repetition. Okay, so the creeping things, male and female, get in the ark. After 7 days, the waters of the flood came on the earth. Then, verse 11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, we're going back again. In the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, here it is a different depiction, all of the fountains of the great deep, the Tehom. Do you remember when I sort of got really energized at the end of, I think it was the first lecture, and I said, don't forget that this reference to the Tehom in Genesis 1 may be a word play or sound play on Tiamat. Tehom gets invoked in here also, right? So you connect it back to that abyss that was there at the very beginning. That's what opens up and unleashes. Burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were open. The rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And here, they're on the very same day, they're all going to get in the ark. And here's a new detail. Verse 16, all those who entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut the door. Somebody has to. It's interesting here that this is the J, but they want you to know that God actually sealed it in. They all got in the ark. They don't pull the door closed behind them. God shuts the door. Why? Because the waters are coming. So, don't read your text now. Look up. Close your eyes. Imagine. I'm going to read to you verses 17 to 24. This is, if you look at this outline of the text, it's what we call a chiasm. I'm not going to assume everybody knows what chiasm is. It's a form of literary structure. It's a genre where the text unfolds in a series of moments, or excuse me, A, B, C, D, and then C prime, B prime, It's what we call a concentric ring structure, or a parallel, highly parallel structure, where some character, event, moment that happens in A will be mirrored on the back end of the story with A prime. Does that make sense? The pieces all line up. Bless you. Now, one of the things about chiastic structures, if you see them, when you identify them, is that chiasms draw your attention to certain things. One of the things chiasm draws your attention to is the exterior points, the frame. The other thing that chiasm calls your attention to, and is intended to draw your attention to, is that center moment. What is the turning point, or let me say it a different way, what is the climactic moment in the narrative? What are we building towards? And there's a particular beauty in reading the flood narrative as a chiasm. Why? Because you're literally rising up on the waters. The ark is literally rising up on the waters. And the part of this climactic moment, this is an outline by Cotter, Daniel Cotter, who's got a commentary in the Reno Lama series. Wonderful commentary in Genesis. This is his outline. We're going to see the back half in a moment. But notice, what I'm going to read to you is, argue if we were making the film, this would be the climactic moment. So it's verses 17, and I'm going to read all the way to 24, and then we'll see what happens. So don't read your Bibles. I just want you to hear it. It's a weaving of J and P. This is right after the Lord has shut the door behind them. So listen now for the word of God. The flood continued 40 days on the earth, and the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters swelled and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. The waters swelled so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters swelled above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. And all flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds, domestic animals, wild animals, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all human beings. Everything on dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. God blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground. Human beings, animals, creeping things, birds of the air, they were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. And the waters swelled on the earth for 150 days. Okay, so what did you hear? What words stick out to you? Swelling, right? Did you get it? It's over and over, water swelling. What else? Blotting. So we get the swelling of waters, and then the climactic piece here, right, as Cotter has identified at least, is that everything dies, and you're told that several different ways. So blotting is one of them. What else?
We get the listing of the creation again.
Yeah, we're getting the animals, the creeping things, the breathing things. And notice the emphasis, and after we look at your text, you certainly can. But notice the emphasis on all human beings, everything on dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life, right? Really underscoring everything that breathes life is dead. What else?
What struck me when I went back to the visual image in the covering the mountains. You covered the support of, I mean, you're all back into the chaos.
Oh, yeah. So, wonderful. So this notion of the waters, did you all hear that? Because that's actually towards the pinnacle moment. The waters swelled so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered, and then they swelled above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. She's exactly right. The boundaries between the heavenly waters and the earthly waters are discernible no longer. Remember, the mountains actually hold up the firmament, hold up the frame that is keeping the waters above. And now this flood has surpassed that. So there is a sense, if you're paying attention to those details, that all is water now. There's no discernible sort of heaven water. It's all chaotic water. Anything else you observed or heard? This is one of those up with people kind of lectures. Okay, so one of these feel-good lectures. Okay, so let's hold that moment, and I want you to see what happens next. So Cotter, I want to see where you are. Cotter's going to say the moment, the climactic moment, is the utter devastation and destruction of all living things.
There's a nice thought.
Yes. And then notice this is on the back end. So, oh, sorry. I think, did I do that? I can't get that all the way. Anyway, you've seen the front half. This is the resolution on the back end. So the pivot happens with the utter destruction, and then we start moving into what happens after the utter destruction. So let's look at verses 8, 1 to 5. But God remembered Noah and all of the living things, all the wild animals, and the domestic animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. I heard it. Oh. All right. Okay, now, other interpreters say the climactic moment is not the destruction. The climactic moment is the moment God remembers. The turning point is when God remembers Noah and the people on the ark. And once God remembers, God is stirred to new action. It happens all over the Old Testament. When God remembers. Now, this always prompts in a seminary classroom, well, did God forget? No, not strictly speaking in the way Hebrew thought works, or even maybe the way English works. When you remember something, it's not necessarily that you've forgotten it. When you remember something, it has been called back to your attention. You have been remembered with it. You've been refocused upon it. You are recalling it. It is now more in your purview than it was previously. Same is true in Hebrew. The opposite of remember is not necessarily forget. God here remembers Noah. So one other place, well, this phrase about God remembering happens all over the place. And it's often, as we move into the ancestral stories, it's all about remembering the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? That's the memory of God that fuels action over and over and over again by God on behalf of God's people. God remembers. And this is where you meet it for the first time. So God remembers Noah and the wild animals and the domestic animals. And what happens the moment God remembers? God moves to do a new thing. And here, it's a new thing, but it's a familiar thing. A ruach blows over the waters. Y'all remember the ruach Elohim in Genesis 1? It's a ruach blowing over the waters here, and the waters begin to subside. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rains from the heavens are restrained back into their storehouses, and the waters gradually recede from the earth. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated, and in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to Noah. Noah on the mountains of Ararat. Noah. The first rest on the backside that Noah provides is that the ark comes to rest in the midst of this abating water. The waters continue to abate until the 10th month, and the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains are happening. Okay, so what's all this on the first day and the 10th day of the month? What's happening? We're marking time, right? The clock is starting to tick out a new calendar post-flood. And one of the features of that, as we'll see as we get further into this particular section, one of the features of that is the repetition now of 7. So at the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made. He sent out a raven and went to and fro until the waters were dried up in the earth. There's a whole tradition about the unruly nature of ravens as a result of this verse. That the raven goes out and just doesn't come back. And there's a midrash that talks about how Noah gets really angry at the raven, gets really annoyed that the raven just doesn't behave and doesn't. So that there's this. So it becomes an etiology for tensions between humans and ravens, which I just. But in any case, the raven goes out to and fro until the waters are dried up from the earth. He sent a dove, and then the dove is seen as this gracious creature that is actually a faithful companion of the human. The dove found no Noach to set its foot, right? Found no place of rest to set its foot. And it returned to him on the ark, for the waters were still on the whole earth. He put out his hand, took it, and brought it in with him. He waited 7 days. Sent a dove out from the ark. The dove comes back. In its beak is this freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew there was now ground, soil. He waited another 7 days. Are you hearing it? 7 days. And sent out the dove. It did not return to him anymore. So in the 601st year, on the first month, on the first day of the month, the waters were dried up. We get for the first time the same language being used for dry land that we got in Genesis 1. It's finally here. 7 days, 7 days, 7 days, and now it's here. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked and saw the face of the ground was drying. This whole notion that everything is now drying off. In the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. Yabashah was dry, finally. And here's the command to go out from the ark. Bring everything out with you, and so on. Go out of the ark by families. This is the family language hasn't been used until this point. Some see it as anticipating the Exodus, going out from the ark by families. So then here we get to the culminating moment. Oh my, is it really 10 of 9? Okay, culminating moment. So Noah built an altar to the Lord. We're almost done. And took every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So the first thing Noah does when he's finally off the ark is worships God. Builds an altar. This is good. The building of the altar and the offering of sacrifices or invoking the name of the Lord is going to become a heartbeat across the ancestral narratives. This is a sort of early practice of fidelity and faithfulness. Building an altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, what kind of source do you think we're working with? Probably J, right? Probably J. This is the God who likes the garden and gardening and potting and actually really likes the smell of meat. So the Lord smelled the pleasant odor, and God said in God's heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. And it goes on from there. Has the human heart changed as a result of the flood? No. What has changed? God's heart. So the link back, this is the Yahweh's frame to the flood story, begins with the pathos of God and the pain caused by the only evil condition of the human population that prompts the flood. If you think that the flood is going to cause a conversion or a coming to greatness on the part of humankind, it does not. The same humans that got on the ark get off the ark, blameless and upright in their generation. And God looks down and says the human condition is still the same. What's different now is that God resolves to live with that human situation differently. I will never again blot out. I will never again curse the ground because of humankind. Okay, so for time. What follows in chapter 9 is a continuation of the creation themes, including, of course, the imperative to be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth. The fear and the dread of you shall rest on every animal on the earth and every bird of the air and everything that creeps on the ground and fish of the sea. Do you hear it? You're getting a recommissioning of the responsibility to have dominion. It's a little different language. The fear of you, the dread of you, shall rest on every animal. It's different, but it's nonetheless a position of authority, position of power. And we are still to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Echoes of Genesis 1. There is a valuing of human life, the shedding of a person's blood. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by the human shall that person's blood be shed. The value of human blood, which you've heard only referenced previously to this in the crying out of Abel's blood from the ground. So blood, we don't have enough time to talk about the significance of blood in Israelite ritual and cultic understanding. But blood is the life stuff. And you don't mess. A lot of the purity issues in the covenant laws are about the liquids, the fluids of life. And blood is front and center, right? Blood, you don't mess with life, which is blood. Then God made the covenant. And the covenant, of course, I will establish my covenant, shall not be cut, flesh shall not be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. This is the sign of the covenant I make between me and you and every living creature. For all generations I have set my bow in the clouds. It will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Okay, this is now as the art, and as almost, if you search Noah, Google Images, Noah covenant bow, what do you think comes up?
Rainbow.
More pictures of rainbows than you ever can imagine, right? Noah, flood, or God's covenant bow, rainbows, right? We immediately think of that, and there's probably really an etiology to explain the rainbow. But here's the thing, the Hebrew word that's used there is keshet. And a keshet is a warrior bow. A keshet, so this is the flood, that is, if we read this in its ancient Near Eastern understanding, the God who brings the flood is the warrior God. This is God coming against God's own creation in an act of war, really, destruction. That is limited, only a certain duration of days, has the possibility of Noah and his family and all the creatures surviving, but is an act of consequence for human corruption. It's the divine warrior. What does God do in this covenant with Noah and his descendants? He sets the warrior bow down. And in fact, some interpreters have emphasized it's the warrior bow at rest, because notice when you think about the shape of a rainbow, it's not actually even facing the earth. It's facing out of the earth, right? If the bow, am I right? So the bow. So if you're like this, right, the bow's been put down like that. So even if it were armed, so to speak, it would not be armed in the direction of creation. So the warrior God here resolves never again to bring war against God's own creation through the flood, through a flood. Okay. So, can I say one thing about where this story has some great significance later in Israel's history? It's on the screen. But flip, if you will. We are going to leave Genesis for just a second. And flip over to Isaiah chapter 54. So, I'll do this as quickly as I can, just so you get the sense of it. There is a significant figure. There is a very significant figure in Israel's theology who recurs across prophetic texts particularly, and that is the figure of daughter Zion, the city personified as a woman, Jerusalem personified as a woman. We first get introduced to the notion of this personified city, or Zion, in Hosea, where we get a broken family metaphor introduced at the beginning of the book. We've all thought about the prophet Hosea and the love metaphor, that Israel and God are in a relationship like a husband and a wife. And in the opening scenes of Hosea, Hosea is charged to marry Gomer, a promiscuous woman, in order to embody in his own marital life the promiscuity of Israel in its relationship with God, Israel's husband. We could have a whole class on that metaphor, both its potentials and its perils. That notion of how Israel is in relationship with Yahweh, as fierce as a covenant relationship of marriage, gets developed also in Jeremiah, where there is actually the family is broken up, the woman is distraught, the children are separated, and the pain of this relationship grows to catastrophic levels that are ultimately articulated firmly in Lamentations, where she is bereft, the city is destroyed. This is the text all about the destruction of Jerusalem. The city is destroyed. She cannot find her children. She has no comforter. And the refrain across Lamentations is, there was no one to comfort her. There was no one to comfort her. There was no one to comfort her. all about the deportations to Babylon, right, the destruction of Jerusalem, which Deb preached about yesterday, 2 days ago. Utter devastation. Right? The city is in mourning. The city is this woman is divorced. There has been a bill of decree. God has divorced her. She is now a widow with no children. I mean, she's not a widow. She's a divorcee with no children. It's harsh. The metaphor is harsh. In 2nd Isaiah, prophet who is then speaking to the exilic community later and trying to encourage them back to return to their homeland. 2nd Isaiah brilliantly pulls on this very long, 8th century on, tradition of this relationship between Israel and God as being that of a relationship between a husband and a wife. And 2nd Isaiah develops poems about the daughter Zion figure and the reconciliation of the family. Children, people of Israel, the city, and God. And at the culminating moment, you're wondering where Noah is in all this, right? The culminating moment, the last poem, 2nd Isaiah talks about the servant figure, the suffering servant. So Christians typically know about the suffering servant poems. Right alongside the suffering servant poems are these poems about daughter Zion, and they're like this across the end of 2nd Isaiah, shoulder to shoulder. So I'm going to back you into this. This is the last and longest of the daughter Zion poems. Start in Isaiah 54. Is everybody there? Mm-hmm. Sing, O barren one who did not bear, burst into song and shout, you who have not been in labor. For the children of the desolate woman, that is Zion, will be more than the children of her that is married, said the Lord. Enlarge the side of your tent, let the curtains of your habitations be stretched out. Do not hold back. Lengthen your cords, strengthen your stakes. For you will be spread out to the right and the left, and your descendants will possess the nations and will settle the desolate towns. Do not fear, for you will not be ashamed. Do not be discouraged, for you will not suffer disgrace. You will forget the shame of your youth, and the disgrace of your widowhood you will remember no more. For the Maker is your husband. The Holy One of Hosts, the Lord of Hosts is his name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer, the God of the whole earth he is called. And here it is. For the Lord has called you like a wife forsaken and grieved in spirit, like the wife of a man's youth when she is cast off, says your God. For a brief moment I abandoned you. But with great compassion I will gather you. In overflowing wrath for a moment I hid my face from you, but with everlasting love I will have compassion on you, says the Lord your Redeemer. If you don't have goosebumps now, you should. Verse 9, for this is like the days of Noah to me. Just as I swore that the waters of Noah would never again go over the earth, so I have sworn I will not be angry with you. I will not rebuke you. For the mountains may depart and the hills may be removed, but my steadfast love shall not depart from you, and my covenant of peace shall not be removed, says the Lord, who has compassion on you. What happens in this text is remarkable. Maybe I wasn't clear. You have the admittance on the part of God, the angry husband, the bereft, distraught husband, that for a moment God abandoned his beloved Israel, hid his face, in overflowing wrath cast her off. And now he promises, invoking Noah, never again will I do it. Can I say one thing about a pastoral moment? I was working on this text, the Isaiah text, in a church context, and I read that text, and we were talking a little bit about it in the context, and a woman in the back was clearly upset and left the room. It was a Sunday morning, and I worry, you worry, but you're in the middle of doing something, and somebody went after her. And after the class was over and I cleaned up, I went looking for her to see if I could find out what had happened or if I could be of any help. I didn't know what had happened, but clearly she was distraught and she left. And I found her, and she was sitting in the sanctuary. It's sort of in the dark, up in the balcony in the back, and she was sort of facing away from the door. And I sat down. And I said, I really don't want to intrude, but I noticed that when we were working on that particular text, that you were very upset and you left the room. And I just want to make sure you're okay. And if there's anything you want to talk about, I'm happy to talk about it. And she said, I have been in a season, I'm not going to do her justice, but she says, I've been in a season of feeling utter divine abandonment. I have felt forsaken by God. And she said, but everywhere I turn, from my pastor to my friends to my well-meaning colleagues in the church community, everywhere I turn, everybody tells me again and again and again, you are never separated from the love of God. God has not abandoned you. God has not forgotten you. God has not forsaken you. And she said, and every time they say it, I feel like saying, you're not hearing me. I actually am claiming out of my own experience a sense of divine abandonment. And it doesn't actually help me for you to smooth over your discomfort with my experience by telling me God never separates God's self from you. And she said, and then you read that text, she said, that I didn't know about, where it says, God says, yes, for a brief moment I abandoned you, and with great compassion I will gather you. And she said, and just for today, I might stay for church. Sometimes the word that is the way forward is not the word we in our best intentions offer. So it's 9. And we have to talk about Babel. I mean, he's carrying that. He's ready to go. It's going to be really good. I mean, we gotta get there. Okay, so just briefly, and I'll close with just a couple of smatterings of interpretations of the Tower of Babel. We won't read it as close as this. One thing to note, though, I think I'm covering up my own screen. One thing to note is that the Table of Nations, if you haven't read it lately, which is Table of Nations is actually a fascinating piece. There's a wonderful quote from Robert Alter that says the Table of Nations, this is Genesis 10, this is the next major piece of the text, is a serious attempt that is unprecedented in the ancient Near East to sketch a panorama of all known human cultures, from Greece and Crete in the west, through Asia Minor and Iran, and down through Mesopotamia and the Arabian Peninsula to northwestern Africa. It's striking, actually, if you trace through. There are various maps you can find online that show you kind of how these descendants of Noah are seen to be the descendants of all of these cultures, politically oriented cultures. Interestingly enough, part of course, the theological assertion is all nations of the world are descended from Noah and this moment, this new creation. All nations of the world are descended from Noah. Secondly, strikingly, Israel is not included in the list. Why? Because Israel is going to be an act of redemptive work by God later. That is, Israel is not ontologically part of the created order. Israel is a gift, is a liberated people for whom a space is made later. And lastly, of course, this spreading in the Table of Nations, languages, cultures, and civilizations, is the fulfillment of the command we have in Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply. Right? So we're getting a return to this new creation. Okay, so just a couple of things. Oh, sorry,
Can I just lead you quickly down the source criticism route?
Yes.
On this passage? Textually, does this look like a later accretion? I gather that the whole thing is
yes, yes. Likely genealogies are likely to priestly letters. It's probably exilic, if not early post-exilic. So some of the cultures that are being named here, names are either anachronistic or we're just not exactly sure. But it's likely a 5th century, late 6th, early 5th century piece. Yeah, but quite remarkable. All right, so I'm just going to say a few things about the Tower of Babel. Truly, only 10 minutes on time. The first thing to note, if you're reading the Tower of Babel story, is that it is a very well-crafted narrative. It's going to feel a lot like Genesis 1 in how well-crafted it is. And let me say this, if you hear nothing else about the Tower of Babel. We started our study Sunday morning with Genesis 1 and 2 and saying there are 2 creation stories. And some of you were playing with, well, is one a creation and the other sort of an extrapolation? I mean, we can talk about that all you want. But you basically have 2 notions of how things come to be in the created order in Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 10 and 11 are similarly diptychs at the end of this primeval history, talking about the explosion of civilizations and languages and culture. 10, the Table of Nations, simply asserts that the descendants of Noah are responsible for the spread of civilization and languages and cultures. It's a result of these people spreading out and fulfilling the divine commission to be fruitful and multiply. 11 is going to offer a different interpretation, a different look. Now, why is it that we babble? Why is it that we speak different languages and don't understand one another? The story starts with human action. The first 4 verses are all about human action. What I will emphasize here is the notion of uniformity, comprehensiveness. We are all of one task. Thinkers, I had my notes. Thinkers become speakers, become makers, become builders, all in one name. So, you need me to stop. Oh, I have 5 minutes. Okay, sorry, I missed the language. I don't know the code. 5 minutes. So, you're really cramping in here. So one tongue, one lip, one word, right? They're all migrating together. They settle there. And then notice all of this first common plural language. Come, let us make bricks. Let us completely burn them. Let us build for ourselves a city and a tower. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered. It's all about we, us, us, us. Do you hear it? Mm-hmm. And they think together, they make together, they build together. A lot of how you interpret the human action, the first 4 verses, depends on how you understand certain of their key actions. What does it mean to build a city and a tower? Is that necessarily a negative thing? Ancient cultures were known to build ziggurats in order to get to the heavens, right? Ancient cultures were known to build cities. Table of Nations, chapter before, doesn't seem at all concerned about the construction of culture. So how do you understand their project, the nature of their project? And secondly, what does it mean to build and make a name for ourselves? Is that inherently an act of hubris, pride, arrogance? Or, as it also functions in the ancient world and for ancient Israel, making a name for yourself is simply making sure the descendants after you perpetuate the family, right? What you knew you had in the form of an afterlife were your descendants. Let us make a name for ourselves, a reputable name for ourselves, being fruitful and multiplying, perhaps. All right, so how you understand those 2 pieces is particularly important. They are clearly concerned about being scattered, right? They're doing all of this lest they be scattered. The second half of the story is all about God's actions and the conclusions to this. So the story is balanced. Human action, uniformity, one voice, one purpose, one project. God comes down in the second half in order to see the city and the tower that humankind had built. Yahweh observes that they are, in fact, one people with one tongue. This is only the beginning of what they will do. And God then uses plural language again, as we heard in Genesis 1. Come, let us go down, and let us baffle their tongue, so that each will not understand the tongue of their neighbor. So what does Yahweh do? Exactly the thing they don't want to have happen. Yahweh scatters them upon the face of all the earth. They stop building the city. Notice, God does not destroy the city. They simply cease from building it. And then we get the explanation. Well, this is a city named Babel because Yahweh baffled the tongue on the earth, and Yahweh scattered them on the face of all the earth. So you all have the story? Human action, uniformity, purpose, one project. Divine action is to come down and baffle the language so that they leave the city and scatter. So, I'm not going to read all this, I'm just going to highlight a few things. The classic interpretation of this story, the one you probably all know well, is that the building of the city and the tower is an act of pride. It's an act of arrogance. It's an attempt to get up in the heavens and be like God. And God comes down to foil that plan, right? And so, by virtue of that, notice as some of these recent scholars, this is a battle that was waged recently. I have 1 minute, 2 minutes. This is a battle, some of this may not just get on tape, I'm sorry to say. the reference at the top, you see I noted the Journal of Biblical Literature 2007 to 2009. That the Journal of Biblical Literature is called by many the flagship journal of the biblical field, biblical studies scholars. It's sort of the peer-reviewed journal, one of them. As recently as 2007 to 2009, there were a spate of articles about how to interpret Genesis 11. So you have Andre Lecoq saying, the tower building is an act of prideful idolatry that plays a climactic role in the Yahweh's agenda to depict the growth of sin. Therefore, diversity and culture is a consequence of sin. It's coming, wait. So then J.T. Strong is writing in a similar period, writes, these are mostly Western American biblical scholars. Tower building is an act of idolatry, like in the ancient Near Eastern kings that would set up these victory stelas and celebrate their accomplishments. Tower building is an act of idolatry. Humans seek to put their own image, their own face on construction, advancement, instead of the image of God. Ellen Van Volde says instead, well, the scattering of humankind expresses the divine intent that humanity be fruitful and multiply. So what the scattering is, she's not really all that concerned about the tower. The scattering is actually so that God's intent that we be fruitful and multiply and spread through the earth may be realized. So God scatters them to make sure that charge is accomplished. Ted Hebert at McCormick writes, the story celebrates Babylon as the cradle of civilization and the origin of diverse cultures in which God revels. So where do they settle? They settle in the valley of Shinar, Babylon, and the cultures come out from there. So Ted Hebert says historically, it's really not about idolatry at all. It's about the beginning of ancient civilization and the spread of cultures. Do you hear it? We're debating it. So notice, in all of these interpretations from mostly Western scholars, it's largely about the uniformity of purpose, idolatry of building, and what the effect of scattering. Why are we scattered in the way that we are scattered? Too much text, I know. But here are brothers and sisters in other areas of the world reading this text. So Severino Croato, a now deceased, wonderful biblical scholar from Argentina. The proud center of Genesis 11 is not universal humanity, but Babel itself, the Babylonian Empire of the 6th century, with its concentration of power, its oppressive control, and its efforts in the patterns of empires to impose a uniform language, a normative worldview, and a culture.
Yeah.
The uniformity imposed by Babylon is the problem God sees and punishes by destroying the city and the tower. So here